Trevor Hambayi, Economist. Thank you so much for joining me on this edition of This Day.
It's always a pleasure to be in your presence.
Let's talk about the Lobito Corridor. It has been hailed as a game changer for regional trade for the DRC, Zambia, and Angola, but also the region generally. From an economist's perspective, what makes this project significant for Zambia, if at all?
So the first aspect that drives the significance around this Lobito Corridor being a game changer is that Zambia is landlocked. We have changed this narrative now. It has become land-linked. And for us to be able to get our products, export goods to the continental market, is that we need to get to a port. And this Lobito Corridor is looking to be able to change that narrative for us to be able to transition from the country into the ports that we're going into. The key issue that comes around this is obviously the timing around where it is being done, that it is being done now in 2025. There's a lot of modern technology that has come into space where rail line can go as fast as your airplane. So essentially is that we should be able to get to the port within a couple of hours or within a day in terms of having to move these goods, and it is the quantum of goods that you can move at one time. And this is what changes the narrative. The second aspect is, generally speaking, as a country, we've been looking at having to be able to move copper production or mineral production exports from the 800,000 metric tons that we do have to 3 million metric tons. Is that we'll never be able to get 3 million metric tons under the current strategy where we've been moving it by road because it becomes expensive. This issue around having to be able to put it on the rail line changes the narrative as to how quickly we can achieve that target of 3 million metric tons.
And I guess the reasoning behind what you've just said is that the development of the Lobito Corridor, for it to work, would obviously need to be the latest technology, not rail as we know it today in the context of Zambia, but to a much more advanced state, and this would be the most effective way for this to work.
This is the most effective way to work, is that if you're looking to be able to move large volumes of any particular commodity, at the most cost-effective way is that you need to move them in rail. You know that rail is one of the most cheapest ways of having to be able to move any goods. Firstly, you must also appreciate that the strategies that we've been using around the road infrastructure is that this has been very expensive. You can see how much maintenance is required to be able to maintain road infrastructure because of the heavy goods of trucks that are using this on a daily basis. If you think about it, right now we have we are doing around 700,000 metric tons of copper on an annual basis. That 700,000 metric tons of copper is around 80 trucks on a daily basis, nearly 100 trucks every day having to run to take this copper to the port. And it takes between 3 and 4 days for those trucks to get to the port. They has to go through 3 borders before they actually get to that port. This is a very expensive and inefficient way of having to be able to do it. And this is the narrative that it changes.
While that narrative changes in that context, there has been a worry as well that such fast development and such a fast transition could also result in leaving some people behind. And these are the 80 to 100 trucks that are doing business on a daily basis that could potentially be taken out of business. Is this supposed to be a genuine fear that citizens must have with regards this economic shift?
I don't think it should be a fear. What we fear in any time is change. Change always comes with a changing narrative. And yes, it changes the norm. And when we change the norm, people have got fear. So firstly, is that what you will find is that having to have this rail line creates other opportunities. The first one, in terms of the trucking, is that you still need to be able to move your commodity, whatever product it is, whether it is copper, from where it is manufactured to the point of loading. That is still transportation, which is local. And secondly, is that there are other issues that come into play. So you also create new facilities for you to be able to load this product onto the rail line. That is another infrastructure that you create that wasn't there before. Secondly, is that right along the rail line is that business opportunities are created, because that rail line will stop in different locations to be able to do this. What it does is you telling me that us having to build the Ndola Kitwe highway is going to take away the business of the ones that are flying. It doesn't. Is that it is just an option that creates a different alternative. Is that generally speaking, when you have got that infrastructure growth, there is always great opportunity that is created. It is just different from the one that you had before, but it will be there.
While this corridor promises to lower transport costs, there is also a concern that is around increasing freight charges on the Angolan railway segment of the Lobito corridor. How would you say this would affect the project's viability, its competitiveness, and Zambia's export ambitions? Because we're not just talking about one country, there's other sovereign states involved in this project.
So what you see is that an infrastructure like that creates competition, and competition is always good for business. What competition does is that it lowers prices, the issues around demand and supply. If you are overpriced in terms of your pricing, is that you will not get the business. So generally speaking, is that Angola would want to ensure that this project, because they are party to this, is also viable, not just for them, but for us as well. So essentially, in terms of their pricing, they would need to be able to align the pricing to meet the competitive edge of having to do business. Remember, is that as a country, there is also a very good possibility Zambia will be developing the Tazara or revamping the Tazara route, which is also heading into another port. And essentially is that they have to be competitive enough for them to compete with that other option. And which is the same thing, is that the rail line must be more competitive than having to go by road. So essentially, that is a business decision that will come into play once this infrastructure has been put to ensure that it is competitive.
Let us turn our attention to other sectors as well. I mean, we know that a lot of the talk around the Lobito corridor has been about the mining sector. These countries are rich in minerals. All three countries are pretty wealthy in minerals, and this is supposed to contribute to the global economy and the shift in demand for minerals. But Zambia is also looking at diversifying its economy. What do you think this does to Zambia's diversification agenda?
So, Jonah, I think in terms of having to be able to drive the agenda around the Lobito corridor, the country would have to look very seriously as to what its agenda for the country is, which is basically having to move the country to being a middle-income country. One of the ways that we need to be able to do this is to ensure that we can do value addition for the minerals and any products that we do have in the country to do this. But to remember, even for the finished product that we want to be able to do after adding value, is that it still needs to be exported. Then it still goes through the Lobito corridor. But the agenda around having to ensure that we can align the country's position to ensure value addition to our product is very critical. We cannot afford as a country anymore to be able to just send out the critical minerals in their raw form to go out of the country. And I'm not sure in terms of the approach that we do have, that we are not just talking about taking the raw materials. If you look at the West, yes, they'll be wanting to be able to take the raw materials in their raw form, because this is where their value is going to be, that they can make finished product and sell it back to us. But as a country, is that the African continent now must be moving to an agenda where they are actually processing the critical minerals into finished products and exporting the finished product through that transit route.
This initiative is being supported by the people that are ideally supposed to be buying these raw materials, and it is far much better for them to buy the raw materials than to get a product that has value added onto it. How deliberate do you think countries like Zambia must then become? Because there's obviously intentions with regards to the minerals found in Zambia, and as others would say, everybody else has intentions with our minerals except us. And so they're so intentional that they support us with the Lobito corridor. And that simply means they don't want our finished product. They want our raw material. And how do we make sure that we also have a finished product that's going to be valuable to them?
So, Jonah, this starts now when we're negotiating the treaties on the financing for the Lobito Corridor. If you look at the agenda around the financing agreements that they're putting together, is this financing has been coming from the European countries, it's been coming from the United States in terms of what they're investing. I'm not sure, I think they were talking between 1 billion to 3 billion in terms of having to get this infrastructure of the Lobito Corridor done. Is that this is critical in terms of how we structure this financing. In terms of the financing, is that obviously the simplest one that we should be having is debt financing that is aligned to the productivity or revenue that is being generated from having to provide the service, is the simplest one. But in terms of bilateral agreement, is that you know that this funding might not exactly be aligned to the actual project. It's a bilateral support to the country, an agreement between governments, and irrespective of what is happening with the Lobito Corridor, those funds will be due. And this is the key, whether it is considered as part of the concessions that we're going to have within the critical minerals. Is this aligned to the minerals that you actually be exporting, or this aligned to the service that you'll be providing from the rail line, or is this just a debt between two governments, a bilateral loan? And this is important to be able to do, but it must give the country the leeway that we maintain our economic sovereignty, that we are not tied down by actually giving away our minerals to be able to repay this loan.
History has been very consistent that we're not very good at what you're saying, and we've made some serious mistakes that people, the citizens, or for example, of Zambia are having to pay for even today. Is this really something people should be confident with? Because these conversations seem to come up every 10 years. I mean, in 2011, the conversation was around the Euro bonds and the worry that Zambia would get into debt, and guess what happened? Zambia got into unsustainable debt. And now we're talking about minerals, which we surely should be much more careful with, but the confidence doesn't seem to be pointing in the direction of ultimate benefit for people.
I hate to agree with you, but generally speaking, this does happen. History repeats itself. Firstly, in terms of any leadership that we do have for any country, it doesn't matter which country it is, whether we're talking about Angola, DRC, or Zambia, is that they must act in the best interest of the country. And that best interest of the country is for the future of this country, that we do not put the country in a position where we are compromised, either economically or politically. And this issue is obviously an issue that you have raised. We will see this again in a couple of years when we start to look at this. Then when we learn the fact that the agreement that we signed actually sold our minerals before they were even dug out of the ground. But essentially is that obviously our appeal is that government should act in the best interest of the country to ensure that we have not sold the minerals that we have in mind just to finance the project. Otherwise, we had needed to relook at how we are financing this. There are two interests that you do have. Remember, the countries that are financing this have got their own interest. We, the ones that have got the minerals, have also got our own interest. It is an issue where we are able to meet a balance in between. It cannot be this inherent issue that we've always been having, where the foreign entities always seem to have a better hand in our own country, and we leave our own people out of the narrative. So if you look at the equation, is that while we're doing this, increasing our mining production from 1 million to 3 million metric tons, is that what you do want is a 60% ownership, equity position of Zambians in that 3 million metric tons. It is not just about having to be able to give it to foreigners. And this happens because the foreigners are willing to bribe our officials for the immediate gain. Remember, when we talk about the issues of the future of this country, is that that benefit does not come for a very long time. And the leaders that are sitting in office do not want to wait for the long time. They want to be able to get their benefits now. And this is the reason every time there's a change of government, we start to hear the issues around how much of the country the previous government sold away, and we have to start to renegotiate our position. This is the story with the debt restructuring.
But when you look at value addition that we've talked about, for a lot of people, it's not very clear what would ultimately be value addition. When you talk about these minerals, we say we need to add value to these minerals before they head out. What exactly does adding value to copper, for example, look like? What does this look like for Zambia's economy? And what would we be sending to the rest of the world as a product of copper that has value added onto it?
So there are a number of areas. So if you look at copper, the biggest product that is made out of copper is copper wire, which is basically your electric cables. These electric cables are used in electric vehicles, and they are used in everything in terms of your house. Your electric wire in the house is made out of copper. And this is the value addition that we're looking at. The one that is not mentioned a lot is that bullets are made out of copper. So in the times like now, when there are wars all over the world, there are global conflicts across the world, is that people are making money by making bullets. And this is what we should have been doing here, because the copper is local and would have been making this. This is military equipment. So essentially is that there's an opportunity. Unfortunately is that obviously bullets is not a very happy product. It takes away lives. But it is not about what it is not the one who's making that is creating the problem. It's the one who's using it. And they sell it all over the world. From the copper that we are producing is another option that you're able to make, and that is quite a large quantity of copper. So essentially, this is what value addition would be looking like. But right now, you've seen the price of copper has gone over the 10,000 metric tons. By 2027, they expect that copper will get to $12,000 per metric ton. And this is also around driving the issue around electric vehicles. So we should not be talking about exporting the copper, is that we need to be able to sign agreements to be able to manufacture the electric cables that are going into electric vehicles within the country. This is the value addition that we're looking for. It changes the dynamics completely, because that price will be double the price that we're actually getting now from what we are producing at 10,000. That value might increase to $15,000 per metric ton once you've got a finished product.
We've got steel plants here in Zambia. We're now making our own fertilizer, and these are, I'm talking about billion-dollar projects that are being implemented here in Zambia. Surely it cannot be so far-fetched for Zambia to be manufacturing copper cables, electric cables, and things in between that you've mentioned. From your assessment, why haven't these things been done in forever years?
So there are two sides. Locally is that you and me will be able to see this opportunity that I can do this business in terms of having to do manufacturing. I have got raw material that is here, but it is so hard for a local entity to get the financing that is required to do this. Remember, in terms of manufacturing, is that you need to put up infrastructure for which it is capital investment, and it requires 7 to 10 years for you to pay it off, for you to build the factory, for you to be able to buy the equipment, install all this processing equipment that is required. And generally is that it is unlikely that as a Zambian you'll be able to find this capital. If you do find the capital is too expensive. At 32%, you are dead before you even start, because you have to pay it over a long period of time. You can only borrow that kind of money if you're paying it over a short period of time. The foreign entities that come into the country have money that they've brought from outside, which is at concessional rates, between 3 and 6%. And these are the funds that you can put into mining, because it's a long-term project. Before you break even, you can put it into mining, into manufacturing. So what you end up finding is that the ones that are investing in this country, all the large-scale projects that are in the country, are foreign-owned. Is we have not put the environment that is conducive for local enterprises to be part of this equation. And this is a big challenge. And this is what you see, is that everything, whether you wanted to look at the mining entities, whether you're looking at the construction entities, whether you're looking at tourism, ICT, all of them are foreign owned because of the investment that is required, for which Zambians do not have access to. And this is the challenge that we must address. So even when we talk about having to be able to drive this growth, is that you're looking at having to have specific industries that are aligned to the infrastructure, the Lobito corridor, along the corridor, so that they have got easy access to that export route, is that we want to ensure that we have created an environment that allows Zambians to be part of this, not just as workers, but as owners of the entities that are going to be there. Because as workers, we have seen this, that they are still being underpaid when they work in these facilities. But also is that the revenue that is generated in those entities is being externalized out of the country. If they own it as Zambians, is that whatever revenue is generated there is going to be retained in the country. One of the challenges that we have in the country is this volatility in our exchange rate. That volatility is a key factor of the issue that the major entities in the country are all externalizing revenue on a daily basis, which would change the narrative if they were Zambian owned. This will reduce the demand for any money to be externalized on a daily basis.
But we are in the very infancy of this Lobito Corridor project, and it is still in its very much in its planning stage. What should we be doing now to actualize these plans? Because when this ship sets sail, we will be talking about what ifs 20 years from now.
I don't know about the infancy of the project. You know, once the project has been announced, that this project is coming online, we're talking about the financing arrangements. Right now, I think more than 80% of the financing arrangement around how the Lobito corridor is going to be financed has already been agreed. Is that sets the tone as what is going to happen. So essentially is that what we should be doing is, firstly, is that do we have any legal framework that supports a local Zambian to be part of this equation? And at the moment, I still have not seen this in terms of that equation that is speaking to ensure that when the Lobito corridor is fully implemented, a Zambian will be party to this equation. And that party is firstly starting from, are they able to build the infrastructure in terms of plants around the corridor to be able to be part of the equation in terms of the export. Secondly, is that in the mining sector, have we started to have any strategy that is speaking to Zambians actually owning the mines that are going to be providing these critical minerals? The third aspect in that mining sector is that we must also diversify this, is that we've been talking about having to be able to do 3 million metric tons of copper. Is generally, I think that we should be talking about 3 million metric, we should be talking about 1.5 million metric tons of copper and 1.5 million metric tons of all the other minerals. Right now, we've got gold, we've got manganese, we've got sugarlite, all those minerals. Is that can we set a specific target of how much we're going to generate from there in terms of production, but also these ones that we are targeting, are they going to be Zambian owned? And then we can start to say, yes, once this equation comes into play. And fundamentally, as a country, remember we are doing the Lobito corridor. That Lobito corridor is aligned somewhere into the copper belt. Okay? Whether it is Ndola or Kitwe or Chilabombe, where it is actually starting, is that we must also be creating the infrastructure around the country to ensure that we can move goods from around the country into the Lobito corridor rail line. Because what you really have is that we might be saying that our strength is having to be able to grow groundnuts in Chipata. We want to ensure that we have created the infrastructure that is going to be able to move those groundnuts from Chipata into the rail line. If we want to be able to get the amethyst out of Southern Province, we need the infrastructure that is going to move there to get to. It cannot just be the fact that we have got the rail line and this is going to change our narrative. So this is so important that we are addressing this, is that there are a lot of auxiliary supporting services that require to be able to ensure that you can achieve success. Otherwise, we'll have other parties that will come in here and invest, and they'll be benefiting while we are still sitting in the same position and we are saying there is no benefit to what has been invested.
When we talk about the financing of this project, we're talking about $1 billion that is to be supported by the United States and the European Union. And I think that's also just a starting point. Is it even a good deal, $1 billion, that Zambia, DRC, and Angola could not come up with $1 billion? What does this even say about our economies and the long-term returns and ownership of these kinds of investments?
So I strongly believe that as countries, we are still holding this dependency syndrome that we shouldn't. Is that we believe that we cannot achieve anything unless somebody gives us money, which is not true. Generally speaking, the reason anybody is coming into these countries on the African continent to bring money is that they're going to get 4 times more money than they have actually put. Nobody is going to give you $1 billion as a handout. They expect that they're going to generate a return out of that $1 billion they have put. Now, technically, us as a country must be able to see where that return is. So if we did actually say that we wanted to be able to do this, and each of these countries had to put $350 million each to get this, or respectively, you could put it proportionately depending on how long the rail line is within your one country, is that what is that benefit, and then you put that value, is that these countries should have been able to do. We cannot say that we don't have the funds. I would argue with you on a very serious note. 2022 is that we received $1.3 billion grant under the special drawing rights of the IMF, not the extended credit facility. That was an additional one, $1.3 billion. And essentially is that we have those resources. Yes, they were meant to be able to support us post-COVID, but in terms of supporting you, what you want to create is sustainability. The fact that when I have put these resources, they will generate revenue sufficient enough for me to pay it back. So you'll be taking $350 million and say, we're going to put into the Ruto corridor because you know that there's value that is going to be created there. Immediately the project is done, you will have a return. Now, there are certain ways in which you could actually do this. There are those ones who will be saying, look, we don't have the resources. Is that you don't have to have that cash. You don't have to use that cash. Is that we can hold this cash as a guarantee. I will go and borrow from the outside market, international market, 350, and I will deposit my 350 as a guarantee to that loan facility. The project starts to generate the revenue and it starts to repay. It is only in the instance where it has failed to repay that the 350 becomes an issue that we need to draw against it. But your 350 will still be sitting on your account. So essentially is that it is not the fact that we don't have the resources. It's just that we decide to have this dependency syndrome where we think that our only achievable goals is having to be able to borrow additional resources. If you look at the Ruto corridor, one of the challenges that we do have right now is energy. We do not have sufficient energy to be able to run all these facilities we expect to get to 3 million metric tons. And we will not achieve it until we have additional capacity for energy within the country. And we have said a very simple strategy is that we have put 40 million kwacha into CDF. All you needed to do is ask them to take 5%. Each one take 10%, 5% of that amount, 4 million kwacha, 2 million kwacha, to put it into a pool for you to generate sufficient money to put solar plants. And you can put 4, 5 solar plants along that line that is being generated directly from our own resources, which is CDF, depending on how much money you need. Obviously, is that a solar plant is not very easy to build if you're doing it.
Quite expensive, too.
They're quite expensive, but it's $5 million to do a 5 megawatt, okay? It's $1 million a megawatt. So it's $5 million. So essentially is that if you're looking at the $5 million, is that it is going to be 125 million, okay, to do a 5 megawatt. So it means 1 million from each constituency or CD fund will give us 5 million. If they do 4, it means that we'll have 4 solar plants of 20 megawatts. But you can do this every year. Is that it is not the first, is you don't just have to, you can do this from, if you had started in 2021, 2022, 2023, you would have 12 now, because you're building 4 every year of 20 megawatts. So essentially is that we need to be able, firstly in terms of our resources, we need to be prudent about how we use our resources. If you are not able to manage 1,000 kwacha, you can't manage 10,000 kwacha. And this is the principle that we must look at. We are always saying we do not have sufficient money, but we are misusing the one that we do have. It's the same issue around our health sector, is that our health sector has got issues around availability of medicine, but the little resources that we have on the medicine is all stolen. There is no medicine there, even though we have put the money there. And essentially, it doesn't matter how much more money you bring in a structure like that, the problem will still be there.
When you talk about the energy sector, and that's a very critical point around such a massive project, if it's the scale you were talking about when we started, modern technology, fast rail technology is going to require a lot of electricity, which electricity Zambia does not have even at household level. With the energy mix that government and other private players are working towards, do you think we are doing a reasonable, sizable amount of work towards meeting such a demand and for such a project to take off and be effective?
So we are still very far from having to be able to achieve our energy needs to meet our demand. That is the first thing. The second aspect is that we have got a very low electricity access in the rural areas. That percentage is below 40% in the rural areas. And this is where you want to drive your Lobito corridor through, okay? For any infrastructure that you put there to be able to create an environment that creates value for those people, whether it doesn't matter what product I'm going to have to produce, if I'm going to be in any of those regions, I need to have access to energy. So there is going to be a direct challenge that if you are not able to put, so that's why it ends up to the fact that the only one who is able to do this is the multinational who's come from outside with a capital that is firstly affordable and accessible, that they can put up a facility there to produce a specific product in value addition for which they can link it to the Lobito corridor. Whereas the SME, the local who is Zambian, is going to be left behind, because they will not have that access. And this is the narrative that you had needed to change. Firstly is that to change this, there must be specific policy that is speaking to this, which says that if you are a local, you go and invest a certain amount, $20,000 will give you the following incentives, which include fiscal and tax in terms of the incentives. The same benefits that you have given to foreigners is the one that we want you to have locally. Remember, when you do this locally, is that firstly, for you who is local, you are addressing specific needs of the country, which is speaking to poverty. Our highest level of poverty is in the rural areas, 78%. And when you do this, you're addressing that need. The second one is that the value that you're creating is directly for Zambians. Any revenue that you generate is going to be retained in the country. You are not going to convert the cash that you have made into hard currency and externalize it. So firstly is that we must look at the policy. Secondly is we must look at how do we support the locals in terms of access to finance for them to be able to do this, to be competitive. Because I can't compete with a foreigner when the money that I have borrowed to invest is at 32%. Whereas the foreigner comes in here with money that they have borrowed at 6%, and then you give them tax rebates, duty-free imports, and free income tax. How does then the local compete? Because firstly, I have paid the highest tax, and then you have taxed the locals at 5% turnover tax on a monthly basis, which is 44% on an annual basis. And then thirdly is that I have to pay all my taxes when I start. So essentially is that you have made it difficult for a local to compete with a foreigner when they come in here. And this is what is important in terms of ensuring that we create an environment that is inclusive for Zambians, not just attractive to foreigners.
Governance and corruption remain major concerns, especially around cross-border projects, especially around million-dollar projects, hundreds of millions in this case that we're talking about. What institutional safeguards are needed to ensure that there's transparency and fair practice, as well as fair revenue sharing in this project?
It's a very interesting aspect. So in terms of institutional frameworks, it is so unfortunate that we've gotten to a point where the institutions that are meant to be able to provide oversight for transparency are also compromised. This is a situation where if you are arrested for corruption, you are also able to corrupt the institution that is arresting you for corruption. And this is a challenge. So, which is the same issue that we've had prior to this. So remember, you've got the three arms of government, which is the executive, the judiciary, and the parliamentary side, okay? Legislature. Now, they are supposed to provide oversight. We've got a structure that has come into a position where the executive controls everything. The judiciary is no longer independent. The legislature, which is parliament, makes decisions not based on the people they represent, but the interest of the party they stand for. And this is a very big challenge that we've had in this country. And this is the reason we got to a point where we are contracting debt that is unsustainable. Because as long as the Minister of Finance goes to Parliament to request for approval of a debt contract that we're going to take, it will be approved because they are supporting the party, not what is in the best interest of the constituents who they represent for the future. So you might want to be able to look at those issues that we really needed to be able to look. So maybe the question might be, we have vested too much power into the executive for these two other institutions that are meant to provide oversight into the governance of the country to be independent, because they are all aligned to one entity, which is the executive.
Do you think in that context it helps a little bit better in this case that this funding is coming from the United States, from the European Union, and they've got serious safeguards with their taxpayers' money, and that this will be much better safeguarded in terms of these resources for Zambia, as opposed to if we were using our own resources from our coffers?
So, firstly, Jonah, it is so important that as a country we maintain our sovereignty. When people give you funding, is that your position is compromised. And this is the problem that we've had. Right now, we've had this debt restructuring. Prior to this, everybody was complaining that the terms and conditions under which the IMF is going to finance you are not conducive. But they can't be conducive. You have defaulted on your loan because you failed to manage your resources. So this is exactly the situation, is that we cannot be in a position where when we borrow money, our sovereignty, we have to sell our sovereignty because we have to comply to terms and conditions from foreign entities. It is always better to use your own resources. But in this particular instance, it is not about the use of our own resources. It's our governance structure in terms of financial prudence, irrespective of whether the resources have come from outside or they are domestic, is that our financial prudence is always questionable in terms of whether we are utilizing the resources for the right projects that they have been meant for, and whether in terms of having to be able to utilize these resources, we are actually getting the best value. This thing around overpricing in terms of corruption has always been a challenge in this country for the last 5 years. And this is an issue that had needed to be addressed for us to be able to start to move in the positive direction. And I keep saying, until we are able to get past the issues of corruption, we cannot develop this country. And the very simple reason is 97% of our private sector is SMEs. The SMEs do not have the resources to corrupt anybody. They require to be given contracts based on merit. So essentially is that as long as you have corruption, 97% of our economic players will not get the contracts to move them.
And let me get this quite clearly. As we build up towards this project, what are some of the policy shifts that we need to see to maximize economic returns from this project over the next decade of its operation, over the next decades of its operation?
So I think I have lightly touched on this issue in terms of maximizing the benefits that we're going to get here. Is firstly, the project must speak and address the ordinary Zambian. How do ordinary Zambians become part of this equation? That is where the maximum benefit and impact is going to come. For this to happen is that you must have policies that are directly incentivizing them to be part of this equation. In terms of their production, is that how do we get them to start to produce specific products that are aligned towards the export market? In having to be able to do this is that these particular products must be byproducts of local raw materials that we are producing here. And this is, so what you have seen is that we have seen the issue around an announcement around electric vehicle, electric battery, batteries for vehicles being manufactured in the country. That project is international. If you do find what equity position is Zambia, and you find that that position is very small. There are large multinationals that have come to be able to do this. And this then just starts to tell you a narrative that we are already starting from a point where we are being excluded as Zambians to be part of this. And this you must address. So the second one is, if you're looking at how the other countries have developed, the emerging economies, China, the Malaysias, the India, is that they have found a way to be able to incorporate small businesses, all of them manufacturing the same product, to consolidate. You have to set the standards, to set the criteria under which this is done, the financing, the infrastructure that speaks to this, to support them, to be able to get there. But then they are producing the product and you're consolidating this to be able to export. So if we're doing the electric batteries, this project is that we want to be able to find 1,000 small businesses, all of them making electric batteries in an infrastructure, controlled infrastructure, where, so you've heard this one where they keep saying, what is it that these SME business centers, where they build this facility and SMEs can do business there, is that is the kind of structure that they have in China. But all of them are producing one product and they're financed. And this is what they do with laptops. That's what China does. It's got a whole facility, multi-facility zone with 1,000 enterprises all producing components for a laptop. They've been financed by government. They've been supported by government. And then they're consolidated to be able to export this product. So you would not be doing this electric vehicle with one entity, but with 1,000 SMEs, and then it is speaking to you incorporating locals.
Finally, as we conclude this interview, if managed well, some argue that this could be Zambia's most transformative regional infrastructure project since Tazara. Is this something you would equally say, or you'd say we are overestimating its potential and once again putting our eggs in one basket?
I would be saying that in the times where we are, it is going to be one of the most transformative economic projects that we have undertaken for foreign entities. That benefit will not directly benefit Zambians in the short term. The greater value is going to go to foreign entities. Remember, if we move from 1 million metric tons to 3 million metric tons, right now, with 800,000 metric tons of copper that we're producing, we're generating around $8 billion. This $8 billion is 70% of our foreign exchange. All of it is being externalized, other than the small 6% that we retain in tax. And this has been the fight that has been there between government around mineral royalty tax, VAT refunds, because government is trying to get additional revenue out of this. Is that if you want to turn the narrative to ensure that it's actually going to benefit Zambians, you must cover the bottom end, that the Zambians are the ones that are providing the raw materials, are providing the finished product that is going into the Lobito corridor.
Thank you so much, Trevor Hambayi, for talking to me on this day.
It was a pleasure being here.